I was raised on a diet completely of Holocaust in Israel. That was like the basis of my Jewish education growing up. And there was no mention of Palestinians. They literally have kind of stolen the most precious items of our tradition and like manipulated them. It's time to be uncomfortable. It's time to be willing to lose your job, to stand up for your values and say, that's not us. That's not how, that's not me. That's not who I want us to be. That's not what I want my children to be.
Welcome to The Big Picture. My name is Muhammad Hassan, and today I am in Philadelphia on this beautiful sunny day in this beautiful backyard, and I'm sitting here with Rabbi Alissa Wise. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for hosting us in your home.
It's an honor to have you here. Welcome on this creepishly warm November day.
So this is my first time in the city, and so
it's always perfect and lovely.
It's always like this.
Yeah, no.
Good to know. So you are an educator.
Yeah.
You are a rabbi. Mm-hmm. You are an organizer.
Yeah.
And a year ago now, you founded the organization Rabbis for Ceasefire. And at the same time, you published this book, Solidarity is the Political Version of Love, Lessons from Jewish Anti-Zionist Organizing. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And I want to start with this word, love, because it's not a word that we have been hearing much of over the last year.
Yeah.
And it feels very specific that you put this in the title of the book. What does that word mean to you?
Thank you for asking that. Yeah, the title of the book, Solidarity is the Political Version of Love, was not our words, mine and my co-author. It's actually from a Jewish activist organizer named Melanie K. Kantrowitz, and we took it from her because we thought it was such a beautiful encapsulation, of spending, for me, spending my life and career dedicated to Palestine solidarity organizing. I realized that having grown up in a Zionist family and a traditional Jewish family and kind of having a break from that family and finding myself dedicating my life to solidarity, I realized how much that work is really rooted in my love of humanity and of the future. And that it's also rooted in my love of Judaism and the tradition that I was brought up in, right? And so it's all wrapped up there in that. And for me, the idea of solidarity is really about not being altruistic. Like, I'm not doing this work because I have nothing to gain from it, but understanding that I actually have a lot to gain from Palestinian liberation and Palestinian freedom and the freedom of all people. And it's the idea that it is through love, which is the way that we show we care enough about the future to want it to be different. That moves me to be part of this work.
Tell me about this idea about that you have a lot to gain from Palestinian liberation.
Yeah.
Because it's not the argument that we have become used to hearing.
Yeah, and it's not what I lead with, right? It's not like, oh, this is like, I'm here because I'm going to benefit from this, right? But I think as organizers, we need to be honest that self-interest is a really prime motivator for people to get involved in social justice work and organizing, right? Like, what do we gain, right? And, for me, my process of coming to unlearn Zionism began with, first was understanding the Palestinians' experience of apartheid and occupation and dispossession, which wasn't a part of the education I got growing up. I learned that myself when I spent a year studying at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and that's when I was able to learn the real truth and the real history about the Nakba and about the whole experience of Jewish colonization and Jewish supremacy. And the next layer was understanding that Palestinians, of course, are the primary and enduring victims of Zionism, but there's also Jewish life and Jewish culture is compromised, right, by Zionism, right? Judaism is this centuries-old religious and cultural tradition. Zionism is a political ideology 120 years old, and the two have come to be so in sync, right? And they're kind of like there's a campaign so people understand that Judaism and Zionism are the same thing. And that takes away the brilliance and the genius and the spirit of this beautiful tradition that my ancestors safeguarded from generation to generation at times when their lives would have been more comfortable and easy if they had abandoned Judaism especially in Christian Europe if they had converted to Christianity and just left Judaism, right? Like their lives would have been simpler, but they didn't do that, right? So now here I am, and I feel responsible to what my ancestors have done, and I feel, this is my people and my tradition, and I don't want to see it kind of totally hijacked by the Jewish supremacy and this ideology of Zionism. So what I get out of Palestinian liberation is living in a world where all people are treated as sacred, which is a core value of Judaism and a core value that I hold, and being able to ensure that I'm passing on to my kids and future generations a Judaism that is liberatory and that is ethical, right? And that does honor to my ancestors and is worthy of the future.
This idea of survival, I think, is really interesting because it feels like it's so key to the Jewish story.
Yeah.
And as a very simple example, but also kind of I hope it doesn't sound too trivial, but when I was in Lisbon, in Portugal, and we took a food tour around, and they took us to the old Jewish quarter. And one of the things they were showing us was the sausages that are hung on people's doors. And it's a very Portuguese thing, right? You age meat and you dry it. And our guide was telling us that during the Spanish Inquisition, there was an expectation that you had to show that you had converted to Catholicism.
Right.
And you had to kind of actively display that aesthetically. And so what some Jewish families started doing is that they started hanging up these sausages on their door frames, but they were made with beef.
Right.
But they were made to look like they were pork. And as a result, some of the Muslim families who were also trying to kind of hide from the Inquisition started adopting these practices.
Right.
And then this became like a shared, almost this kind of very tiny form of resistance as a way to try and hold on to who you are and your identity.
Yes.
Tell me about this idea of survival and how Jewish people understand it.
Yeah. Well, actually, that story you just told is so beautiful. I hadn't heard that before, but it's actually a perfect encapsulation of kind of the idea of solidarity that I want to be forwarding now in the Jewish community, right? Is like making those alliances and keeping all communities safe. Because I think one of the things that's really clear to me, like I was raised growing up with this idea that Jews, the lesson of the Nazi Holocaust is that Jews are alone in the world, right? And that the only way Jews can be safe is by having this hyper-militarized ethno-state, right? And that was the key to safety, is like, we're doomed to live by the sword because that's the only way we can keep each other safe. And that's a pretty terrifying idea, right? Like, that's actually a very scary idea. And it was as I grew up and started realizing that actually, and became part of movements and became part of the Palestine Solidarity movement, I was like, I actually feel so much safer in the world knowing that I have alliances across faith, across race, across identity and geography, where we have actually real relationship and we're going to look out for each other. And the first 4 Trump years were an embodiment of that, where when there were these violent attacks at Jews worshiping in synagogue, Christian and Muslim neighbors would come and stand outside of our synagogue when we were praying. And then we started to do the same outside of the mosque when the Muslim, and showing up at the airport during the Muslim ban, right? Like, and so there is this like reciprocity, and I think that, for Jews over time, there is this sense of, there's no way to trust people around us, right? Like that's kind of like the main lesson of living in Christian Europe, but there were Jews that lived all in other parts of the world that had a very different story. Like Jews under Muslim Spain had a very different experience of living amongst cross culture and cross faith. And so I think that, survival in Jewish thinking has often been in this frame of us or them. And I think that that's how we got to the devastating place we are now with Zionism and with Jewish supremacy in the state of Israel, right? And so those of us that understand that, a future of like true enduring safety and a way that Jewish people can thrive only works when Muslims are thriving and when Hindus are thriving and Buddhists and Christians all together. Like, there's no way for Jews to find safety and survival if it means another people is being oppressed and murdered, right? Like that's not how safety, it doesn't work like that. Like, and I think that there's, these generations of people who have been like raised in this idea, right, of that this is the way that we find safety. And my hope is that the new rising generation of Jews understand something much more complicated and are willing to try new strategies, right, and of how we go about survival.
This year, this idea of survival has been at the forefront of a lot of how people who argue in defense of Israel and Israel's war in Gaza have leaned on.
Yeah.
That what is happening now is, at its very core, an existential threat, not only to Israel as an idea, as a state, and the Jewish people that live in Israel, but the idea of Jewishness everywhere. That itself is under threat. I'm sure you had people that people in your community that have had those arguments with you.
Yeah.
And I'm really curious as how you respond to them.
To respond to that, to the question of, are you, like, what can you restate?
So if somebody comes to you and says, you need to support Israel, because this is the only safe place for Jewish people, and that what happened on October 7th and what has happened since is a way to erase not only Jewish people in Israel, but this is an attack on all Jews everywhere.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think people would be really hard pressed to substantiate the claim that Jews are safer in Israel, right? I think objectively I'm safer here in the United States as a Jew than Jews are in Israel, right? And, for me, the way that I understand it is that Zionism is a political ideology that's completely separate from Judaism, right? And it's not Judaism and Jewishness, right, that's under attack. It's Zionism, right? And the people who support Zionism, right? And at this point, what that means is also supporting genocide, right? It's supporting mass murder, right? And I feel very protective of Judaism, right? That I don't want that cultural tradition, which scaffolds my whole life, right? Like I am a very religious person still, right? And I don't want that to be mixed with the idea that it's going to be stained with the blood of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, right? And that it would even be possible for Judaism, if that were true, Judaism wouldn't be able to endure as a religious tradition, right? If that's actually what it means. And to me, we have to make really clear that it's about Zionism and the idea of perpetuating Jewish supremacy, which is not just a Jewish idea, and in fact was a Christian idea from its outset, right? Like my own reading of history is that Zionism, as we have it today, as a political ideology, was first fomented by Christian Zionists in the United Kingdom who believed that Jews need to populate historic Palestine to hasten the Second Coming, at which point Jews must convert en masse or burn, right? There's nothing more anti-Semitic than that. And that's the idea. I mean, Balfour was himself a Christian Zionist, right? And most of the parliamentarians under the British Mandate likewise were. And they were fomenting this idea to have a Jewish state in Palestine for their own eschatological ends, right? And we're still seeing the repercussions of that, right? We have here in the US, the largest pro-Israel organization is Christians United for Israel. They boast 11 million members. There's only 7 million Jews in the US, right? And so I think it's just crystal clear to me that Zionism is a political ideology that one can choose to endorse for theological reasons, for self-interested capitalist reasons like weapons manufacturers and others that support Zionism. But that's not Judaism, right? And Judaism, as I actually understand it, is fundamentally anti-Zionist. And what I mean by that is that Judaism, as we know it as a religion, only began after the destruction of the Second Temple. Before that, what you have is Israelite religion that was being practiced. And it was when there was the dispersion, that's when Judaism was created. The Talmud is the basis of Jewish practice, and that was a text that was built in Babylonia, also in historic Palestine, but mainly in Babylonia and around the world as a tool for navigating the experience of living in diaspora and exile as a spiritual concept. And in the Talmud, it says really clearly, you shall not go back to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel. It says in the Talmud, kechoma, which means like as a wall. And then Rashi, who's a medieval commentator, comes later and says, what does it mean not to come as a wall? And it says, you cannot come there with force. It says it explicitly in our tradition. Like, there isn't a longing to by force take this land, right? And that's why you have ultra-Orthodox Jews that are anti-Zionist, right? And that's the theology. They understand, they are practicing kind of by the book, right? Jewish practice that understands that Messianic time is when there can be people can, in this idea of Messianism, which is not something that humans can intervene in, right? That's the difference between Judaism and Christianity, right? Like, Jews aren't playing intermediary or aren't trying to hasten the second coming in the same way that Christians are, but understand that it's Messianic time, which is always, that's part of what I love about Judaism, is that it kind of mirrors the way that what it feels like to be a person, where you're like, I'm separate from the divine and I want to be close to it. And that's like a lifelong and like world long, as long as the world exists, we're going to be trying to feel that sense of yearning to be close to the divine. And that's a spiritual commitment, not one that should be made manifest through guns and walls and bombs and tools of oppression and domination.
That is so interesting that you mentioned that phrase in the Talmud and this idea of a wall, right?
Yeah.
Because I had just been reading about Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who is the so-called father of revisionist Zionism, right? And one of the things that he argued back in the 1920s is that a case for what he called the Iron Wall.
Right, exactly.
That it is necessary to use a wall of force to be able to create this Jewish homeland.
And he wasn't a religious Jew, right? Theodor Herzl was also a secular Jew. It actually took a while for religious Jews to get on board with the idea of Zionism, because it is antithetical to the root, like to the foundational ideas of Judaism, right? I think that it was a PR strategy where they decided to name the country Israel, right? Which is the name of the people, like what Israelite people were referred to in our sacred text. To use the flag is modeled after a traditional prayer shawl. That's right. It was, they literally have kind of stolen the most precious items of our tradition and like manipulated them, right? In order to justify settler colonialism and violence. And I think, to be fair to some of my own ancestors who were early Zionist supporters and pioneers, is that they genuinely, I think, were fearful, right, about this question of Jewish survival, right? And I don't think that it's hard. I mean, I shouldn't say for my particular ancestors, but I think that understanding the ways in which Zionism is a settler colonial project is something that's like very uncomfortable in Jewish communities. Like, it's not something that even progressive Jews are comfortable with understanding, because it goes against the grain of the idea that's kind of been taught to a lot of us, that it was self-protection, right? And it was a way to ensure that Jews had a place to survive, right? The Nazi, like pre and post Nazi Holocaust, right? But it's a much more complicated story than that, right? Of exactly like what what happened on the ground. And actually, for me, one of the first things that I read that kind of helped me change my politics and understanding was Ben-Gurion's diaries, where he says very plainly, right, there's an indigenous population here that we will need to forcibly displace in order to settle and build our country here, right?
I think he even says, that we don't necessarily want to displace them, but we want to be able to secure our ability to live here. And
right, and that'll be by force, right.
And then if that involves kind of going into the West Bank and Transjordan at the time,
Right.
then we'll do what needs to be done, basically.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, I think that part for me is like a thing that I've really struggled with, because I was raised in a Jewish day school, in a Jewish community, where I was raised on a diet completely of Holocaust in Israel. That was like the basis of my Jewish education growing up. And there was no mention of Palestinians, right? It was Arabs, if anybody was ever mentioned, right? And then here I was at Hebrew University as a college student, believing the myth, a land without a people for a people without a land, right? And they like spit me out into the world, believing lies, which, I had to come to kind of work with and understand, like, they didn't know better. They didn't know. But then I opened Ben-Gurion's diary and it's right there. So there's it's like, when I think about accountability of my parents and my teachers and my own family, for them to have not done the work to understand, right? And to be able to take a simplistic narrative of this is just part of like eternal anti-Jewish hatred, right? Like, and I think we saw that post October 7th too, right? That like, that's what that is, without any sense of responsibility and any sense that you have been perpetrating ongoing violence, denying people basic human rights, enacting a system of apartheid, dispossession, like what, there's like lack of accountability for that within the Jewish world, which I think at least I know in the family that I grew up in, it was like, well, we suffered the Nazi Holocaust, so we are let off the hook, right, in some ways, for having this kind of accountability. And I think that's partially what I think we're coming up against in the American Jewish community now, right? And the work that I'm doing with Rabbis for Ceasefire in really trying to shift the American Jewish community, a big part of that is going to be having to go back to the beginning of the story with people and kind of help people re-understand a faulty, false history that they've been taught.
So last month you published a piece in The Nation, and it was called the Jewish Community is Fracturing and It's a Blessing. And it's a provocative title. I want you to tell me about this idea, about what it is that you feel is happening right now in the Jewish American community and why it's important.
So for many decades now, the question of Israel-Palestine has been kind of the third rail in the American Jewish community. People really try to avoid talking about it. It's been under the surface. What has happened since October 7th is that it's no longer able to be avoided, right? And everyone is coming face to face with it. And it's causing a moment of true rupture in the American Jewish community. And the reason that I said it's a blessing is because it's been a long time coming, right? I've been an activist and an organizer trying to bang my head against the wall of the American Jewish community for 2 decades now. And nothing has seemed to be enough to motivate people to truly pick a side, right? It's like, what side are you on, right? And it's like, right now people need to be making that choice, right? Are you gonna go along with a nation state who claims to be in your name, acting in your name, that has killed over 18,000 children, that is deliberately starving a population in Gaza, that has been enacting, let alone that has been acting in brutal occupation and apartheid for centuries, right? That, and what my hope is that this is a moment where, out of this crisis, there can finally be a reckoning where American Jews decide to be on the side of justice, of freedom, of liberation for all people, of understanding that when we say never again about the Holocaust, it has to be never again for anyone. And, I think I'm encouraged about what's possible. When I started Rabbis for Ceasefire last year, it was quite by accident. I kind of thought naively now that I would collect a group of rabbis to write a letter, kind of a statement that would be like an intervention, then soon we would see a ceasefire, right? I didn't understand at the time that this would be going on and on and on. And then the organization kept growing. And here I am now with almost 370 rabbis in Rabbis for Ceasefire. These are spiritual leaders across political affiliation and religious denomination who are coming together to protect life, right? Of saying like every human life is sacred. That includes Palestinian life. And that's kind of the end of it. Like, it's not much deeper than that, right? Yeah. And so right now in the American Jewish community, people are hand-wringing about, especially during the high holidays, of like, where am I going to go pray? I can't have a synagogue that doesn't feel like it's mine, or people complaining, or, you know, worrying about losing their jobs. They live in, if they work in a Jewish community and speak out about their values. And I'm like, it's time for that. It's time to be uncomfortable. You should be uncomfortable when you have an issue where people are being mass murdered in your name. Like, it's time to be willing to lose your job, to stand up for your values and say, that's not us. That's not how, you know, that's not me. That's not who I want us to be. That's not what I want my children to be. You know, and it's painful how many people in the American Jewish community are not taking that stand.
And it's not an easy stand to take, right? And I think you mentioned in the article that in order to enact this step, you have to be willing to break apart everything that you know into a million pieces and rebuild. Rebuild
it again. Yeah, and I think that's, you know, as an organizer, it's really hard, right, to convince people to give up communal comfort, to break with their families, right? And, you know, as we were saying before, like, self-interest is a really powerful motivator in organizing. And you have to have something to bring people to on the other side, right? And so that's what the Rabbis for Ceasefire work that I'm doing is about, is you can't just pull this out from under people, right? And like have nothing to replace it with. So that's why it feels important to me that we're like proactively building alternative institutions outside of Zionist institutions, so that there's a place for people to go to continue to challenge their politics and to learn, but also to like be their whole selves and be able to engage with Jewish tradition and Jewish text and Jewish religious practice, and also be able to stand in solidarity with Palestinians, right? Like, there needs to be a place for people to do both those things and be able to be affirmed in doing all those things. But it is going to involve risk. It is going to involve giving up comfort, you know, and that's been my experience in my own family, you know, like that's been part of my own story. So it's not that I'm asking anybody to do something that I haven't been willing to do myself.
And what was that process like for you personally?
My family moved to Palestine in 1809 from Lithuania and lived in the old city of Jerusalem, and then were some of the first settlers that settled outside the walls of the old city in Jerusalem. And that history was very important and prominent in my family. And my great-grandfather was drafted into the Turkish Ottoman army in World War I and didn't want to go, and had this American friend studying with him in his yeshiva in Jerusalem who helped him immigrate to the US, which is how my family got here. But there's still a street named after him in Jerusalem that we would go visit when I was a child growing up. And that whole history was like really baked into, like, that's something that I should be proud of, right? And then when I moved to Jerusalem later and understood the whole history of what all of that actually meant, right? And the dispossession that required, and that whole history fell apart. So I, in 2002, wrote a coming out letter to my family. It was like I was coming out as gay, but it was coming out as anti-Zionist, which was much more controversial. And it was a big break. Me and my cousin and I actually spent those years in 1999 to 2000 in Jerusalem. We came back to the US, the second Intifada broke out. We joined a group in New York called Jews Against Occupation and started to learn about leftist organizing and direct action. And then we were going out to protest the first year we protested the Israel Day Parade in New York. And we wrote a letter to the family saying, we're protesting the Israel Day Parade. And it was pretty dramatic. We weren't welcome home as long as we were an enemy of the state of Israel, right? We got word from a cousin that they were thinking about taking out an ad in the local Jewish paper where we're from, distancing us from the family and saying they don't represent us. Some people in the community wrote a letter that they sent to the entire synagogue that we belonged to, disowning us. And, it was pretty dramatic. And this was a while ago, before it was like there was such a presence of having Jews, anti-Zionist Jews in the world. So, it's been a struggle, given that this is my life's work, right? And this is what I've decided to dedicate my life to because of the values that were ingrained in me by the same family that now I'm alienated. Like, it's a very complicated thing. Like, I see there being like a thread of values that I was taught as a kid that I'm still pulling on in order to stand up for Palestinian liberation. Like, the reason I went to Gaza at Passover this year to try to bring food was because of the way we celebrated Passover growing up. Yeah. And how I was taught growing up, like, the lesson of the Passover story is, let all who are hungry come and eat. And so I look at Israel enacting a forced starvation, a famine on the people of Gaza. It's my obligation to try to break through that, But then for me, part of that has meant building a different Jewish community and Jewish family around me, and I think that's such an important piece of organizing. In the book that I wrote, the first chapter is actually about that, about building political home. And that in order for people to do work where they are being asked to give up communal comfort, are being asked to leave the families and the rituals and the communities that they grew up in, we have to provide that for people in a new way and build new institutions. And the thing that's really beautiful is that it's happening. Like this year for Rabbis for Ceasefire, for the high holidays, we had 73 congregations across the U.S. sign up and say, we are the communities for Jews who support ceasefire and who are part of the Palestine. That's more than we've ever seen, right? Yeah. So there's indications that it's actually really working. And my hope is that now as we head into another 4 years of a Trump presidency where things will be all the more heightened and intense, it'll only allow us to, like, in a more escalated way, build those communities on the local level that people need.
I think the last part of what I want to talk to you about is, and you've hinted at this throughout this conversation, is the idea of what Jewishness means. And I've heard this from other people too, that the idea that they are taking the stance that they are against Zionism and against Israel is not despite their Jewishness, but it's because of it.
Yeah.
And I want to know, because it's also, I think the really tragic thing is that people such as yourself and who have taken this position, they often get attacked on this particular point, on their Jewishness.
Yeah.
And so I want to know, for someone like you, I mean, you are steeped in this knowledge.
Yeah.
And you teach it, but it's also very personal to you.
Yeah.
What is Judaism? What is Jewishness to you?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So the way that I understand Judaism and Jewishness is that it's a religious civilization that has evolved over time, and it's been in constant perpetual evolution. So what that means is that we have a responsibility to look at what our ancestors have done and the texts and the traditions that have been passed down, but we also have an obligation to bring our political and spiritual and moral commitments from where we stand in our contemporary place, right? And have those two meet. right? And I think that's what Jews have done over time. Like the story I told before of like the rabbi in the Talmud saying you shouldn't go there as a wall, and then the rabbi hundreds of years later in Muslim Spain saying that means don't go with force, and then me, a rabbi in the U.S. in 2024, is saying that's right? Like, so I think and throughout Jewish time, it's Judaism has continued to evolve by necessity because of the political conditions where Jews live, our diasporic nature, right? Like that's something that I feel is really critical to understand about Judaism. As I was saying before, it's a tradition that was founded for the experience of living in diaspora. The core questions of Jewishness, and again, I like mark a difference between like Israelite religion, which is what we find in the Torah, and Judaism, which begins in the Talmud. Like the way Jews practice religious life is Talmudic, it's rabbinic, it's not biblical. Like the biblical stories are the foundation, but the practices of how we eat, like the laws of keeping kosher, those are from rabbinic times, right? That's where we get that. The kind of the 3 times a day prayer that was established instead of be offering sacrifices at the temple, which is what Israelite religion was. They replaced it with 3 times a day prayer, and there's always had to be those kinds of evolutions. And so Judaism, fundamentally to me, is a set of texts and practices and rituals and ways of being that have been passed down for generations in order to make sense of living kind of separate from your creator, right? Which is all of us are separate from our creator, right? And the temple was that place where there was this idea that the divine lived in that temple in Jerusalem. And when the destruction of the temple happened, a whole new religious scaffolding needed to be assembled so that there could still be proximity and relationship to the divine. And so I think fundamentally for me, that's why I understand it that Judaism and Zionism are not the same thing, but they're actually incompatible. Because when you answer the question of Jewish relationship to that land with domination and oppression, when you do it where there's no sign of messianic time, where there's no sign of liberation and freedom, where some people are being denied their rights, like that's a desecration of the tradition as I understand it.
I just thought about, as you were talking about this idea of looking at, Judaism is an old religion.
Yeah.
It is a very old religion.
Yeah.
And it has been around for such a long period of time.
We're now in the year 5785.
Wow.
In Jewish time.
Wow.
That's what Rosh Hashanah celebrated.
Almost 6,000 years.
Yeah. And so when you think about Zionism being 120 years old, it's a blip. It's a blip. And I think that's actually a comfort to me when I think about it, because you can look back at Jewish time and notice that their whole, the Talmudic period lasted 700 years, right? And so it's just like when you think about the scale of time and that there's actually still time to put this chapter behind us, right? Like I obviously feel dogged about spending my life doing what I can to remedy what I see as Jewish people going down the wrong path and pulling them back in.
To end our discussion, can I ask you to tell me about this concept of the tree of life?
Oh.
And how it informs what it is that you do.
What makes you ask about the tree of life?
I was reading up about it partly I think it started when I was looking up the Rabbis for Ceasefire website.
Oh yeah.
And I came across this concept and I found it really curious, and so I think I went down a Wikipedia rabbit hole.
Well, no, it's interesting, because there's so many different concepts in Judaism, and I'm just, actually our synagogue, my kids go to their school and they call the school the tree house after the tree of life. So it's a very potent idea, right? Of, it actually goes back to the beginnings of humanity and the story of Adam and Eve, right? And that there's a tree of knowledge, right, that they were not supposed to eat from, right? And they did. And thus we have the kind of contradictions of being a person, right? That's how the story goes, right? And so I think of it as like a cousin to that story, right? You have the tree of knowledge, right? And the tree of life, right? And there's a song that we sing about the tree of life, which is Eitz Chaim hi lamachazikim ba, which is, it is a tree of life to them that hold fast to it, right? Meaning like, do you need me to stop for this? I knew it would happen eventually. There was going to be an emergency. How long can a person sit in a big city without an emergency?
Siren of life.
It's a siren of life. So there's a phrase there's a song that we sing, Eitz Chaim hi lamachazikim ba, which means it is a tree of life to those that hold fast to it, right? And so I actually have always appreciated the conditionality in that, right? It's a tree of life only to those that hold fast to it, right? Like you actually have to be in relationship to it. You have to have the practice, right? And I've been feeling that now of like the core of the work, and I'm kind of like, I have this image of myself just like very prostrate on my knees since October 7th, just kind of in worship and also in humility, right? Of the core basic concept of all life is sacred, right? And that idea that we want people to cling to life, right? That's actually the core work that we're trying to do right now. And it's so humbling and so depressing that's where we are in the American Jewish community, is having to remind people it's a tree of life if you cling to it. And you can't, and which means to me, you can only cling to the tree of life when you put down your weapons, right? When you are refusing to bomb mosques and hospitals and places where refugees are sheltering in tents, right? Like that is the opposite, right? And so I feel like that for those that hold fast to it is actually the key part of the tree of life phrase, is like, how do we hold fast, right, to the tree of life? And how is that the foundation and the root of spiritual life and spiritual practice?
I'm so glad that you mentioned this idea of prostration, right? The humbleness, this has been a tough year, right? It's been a heavy year. And a lot of it has been confusing in a lot of ways. Trying to make sense of the world and of humans has been tough.
Right.
And the only times that I found solace genuinely is when I have thought about God.
Yeah.
And when I have felt like I was putting my trust in God.
Yeah.
And thinking about, from that starting point, about life and about the sacredness of life.
Yeah.
And that all of it on all sides, on both sides of a rifle or an F-35,
right,
that life is sacred on both of these sides, and that there is a tragedy in that is not, that there is a fracture between those people.
Yeah.
And I mean, what if that is the starting point, then what stems from it? How do we take this lesson and then take it into a space where people are really bruised down to a molecular level, and for some people that bruising almost feels like it is stopping them from being able to see things clearly.
Yeah.
How do you take that lesson into the spaces that you are operating in, into the conversations that you are having?
Well, I feel like a really important piece of that is like, of the tree of life concept, as I'm here listening to you, is that you can't, there's no affirming some people's lives, right? And being willing to sacrifice. Like, it doesn't work that way, right? If you affirm life, that's what the abolitionists say. Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, life is precious where life is precious, right? That's the end of it. Like, you can't make those, you can't separate those things. So I think for me, the way that one of the primary strategies that I've been really wanting us to pursue at Rabbis for Ceasefire is working in multi-faith coalition. And I think that's one of the ways that we do that is all the different ways that people strive for having the comfort and the reliability of the divine, however one understands it, and that being the starting point, and from that being able to build coalitions powerful enough to force change, right? And to protect people and to save life. And I think, to me, that's really important because I think it contradicts that core idea of Zionism, of isolationism, right? And that if we are able to build multi-faith coalitions that have a shared perspective of like the need for that cultivation of that sense of humility, for the gratitude and the miracle of human life, and then see ourselves as protectors and safeguards of it in the multivocality that we do it, right? We don't need to say it in the same way or practice it in the same way, but we need each other in order to be able to be successful.
It's a great way to end. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Rabbi Alissa Wise, thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you for coming.
And the book is Solidarity is the Political Version of Love. Lessons from Jewish anti-Zionist Organizing. Get the book. Thank you to Rabbi Alissa Wise for being here. Thank you for listening. As always, we want to hear what you have to say about this conversation, so please leave your thoughts in the comments below. And you can find this episode and all of our episodes in audio format wherever you get your podcast from. Until next time, I'm Mohammed Hassan. Salam.